I am sitting down with Frank Whelan. Or is it Whelan?
Whelan.
Whelan, okay. And he is a historian extraordinaire. How are you, Frank?
Oh, good. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So can
Good
you
to be here.
give us a little tidbit on your background?
Well, okay. I was born in New Jersey, in Orange, New Jersey, and grew up in Livingston, New Jersey, which was a suburb of just about the whole universe in those days, New York area.
Okay.
And my mother and father were both from that area originally. My father's family had been wealthy for a time. They had what was called Whelan's Drug Stores and United Cigar Stores, and then they had some problems, which were called the Great Depression, and they didn't have as much money as they did. My grandfather did okay. But both of my father and my grandfather were very interested in history, and they were the ones who, when I was a little boy, were telling me history stories from American heritage rather than fairy tales. So I was growing up in that kind of milieu, and that's what I always was attracted back. We used to ask my father, and he told me this story one time. When he was young, he at the time was in his 30s, and we were asking him, Dad, what was it like in the olden days? And he said, he told me, he said, my children were asking me what it was like in the olden days. I'm not that old. So why are they asking me this? What do I know?
Right.
So they basically shifted me over to my grandfather, who could really talk about the olden days.
So history has been a big part of your life since day one, right?
Yes, it has, basically.
So I'm assuming living in the Valley here for many, many years now, you've kind of fallen in love with the history of the Lehigh Valley.
Oh, it's fascinating.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, sure.
I'm particularly interested in what was the Lehigh Valley like before the European settlers got here?
Before the European settlers got here, the Native American tribe, Lenape, as we know them, some people call them the Delawares, were the predominant indigenous people here. And they had been here for quite a few years, back as far as they could tell. And the Lehigh Valley at that point was basically a hunting area for the tribes. Allentown was a plateau, and you can still see it in the way it's shaped, and it had a lot of wildlife there. And the Indians would regularly burn it off to encourage the growth, encourage the game up there. And this was a hunting ground. It was basically a hunting ground.
Interesting.
And Bethlehem was roughly the same way for them. They had, along the Lehigh River, it was a focal point for their tribal meetings, and Easton in particular. That's one of the reasons why Easton developed as it did. The forks of the Delaware were considered by the Lenape a place when you wanted to have a meeting of, there was an issue to be discussed, they had it there. And then afterwards, when the colonial settlers came in, it became, because of the Native Americans doing it first, they called that, there's a conference place. And so the forks of the Delaware, during some of those crucial periods in the French and Indian War, had conferences there. This is the 1750s we're talking about now. And the governor from Pennsylvania and the governor from New Jersey. And the Indians, the Native Americans, were very much a focal force in colonial life. And they had links with the French. Not the Lenape didn't, but the other Indian tribes did. And links, the English had the Iroquois. And so these two tribes were not just like we think of Indians and Old Westerns. They were powerful political allies that both colonial powers wanted on their side. And the French in particular, because they had not the money the English had to spend on sending foreign troops over, and plus they didn't have the Navy that they could do that quite as well as the English. So basically the whole area here developed that way. When I was at the call, I used to get people ask me questions about the Lehigh Valley, and I said, I call it a tale of three cities: Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton. And Easton was first because it was founded by the colonial governors, William Penn and those people, William Penn's son, who was not a nice guy, but his other fellows, other people, they concentrated on Easton because that was going to be the capital of this huge, vast territory that they were thinking of. And so it was a civic center, civic place first. Then Bethlehem, of course, with the Moravians, with Count von Zinzendorf coming in 1740s and establishing a place for the Moravians to settle. That became a focal point for their life and their culture here, and it was very, very, especially in the latter part of the 18th century. European people would come here during the American Revolution when so many French officers would come here. And France, of course, at the time was going through the Age of Enlightenment, and the philosophes and the people who were interested in what was going on, they came to Bethlehem to see how a communal city works. And they wrote about it. One of the people who did was Baron de Kalb, who was a German by background, but he had been with the French army in Europe, and he came here and he wrote a long letter home to his wife giving details of what it was like. Because he was German by background, he could talk to the Moravians and get the true dirt, what was going on here. They didn't have to go through an interpreter. So Bethlehem at that point in the 18th century, when it was a Moravian community, that was very important that it made this identity. And Count von Zinzendorf, obviously, was a Central European, and so he was a little bit different than the English people in Philadelphia and people up over in Easton, and there was not always happiness between the bunch. Allentown was founded by William Allen, and William Allen was the largest single landholder in British North America at that time. And he had a number of those kind of investment properties. Originally, he was a merchant, and he came from Philadelphia, and he bought huge amounts of land during. He was around the time of the walking purchase. He was buying up a lot of land. He didn't actually participate in that whole deal. That was more the Penns, Thomas Penn's. But he knew all those people, and he was on the cutting edge of what was. So when the land became available, he bought a lot of it.
So let's talk about the walking purchase for a second, because while I was doing my research for this interview, that's just something that I don't know if the public school system failed me or whatever, but I had no idea that such a historic moment happened right here in the Lehigh Valley. So talk to us a little bit more about the walking purchase. I know you have William Penn, and I believe it was his son,
Thomas Penn.
So William Penn had a great relationship with the Lenape,
right,
to my understanding.
Yes.
And it's Thomas Penn that kind of...
Well, you have to kind of understand the circumstances. And Thomas Penn was a jerk, but he had his reasons for being a jerk.
Okay.
He basically, William Penn was cheated out of his estate in England by an investor who he had approached and was supposed to be taking care of it for him. And so when Thomas Penn and his William Penn's second wife, they inherited this thing, and it was like land, but it was totally disorganized and in debt. And so Thomas Penn basically said, well, we would say today, you pardon the contemporary, they screwed my father, but they're not going to screw me.
Okay.
And so what he basically did was try to find angles to get this land. He owned the Pennsylvania, but his father, as you pointed out, was involved with the deals with the Indians to keep it open for them. And so what they did was they set up this concept of a walking purchase where Thomas Penn came forward with what he said was a deed from his father and the Lenape and other tribes, basically saying that how much land a man could cover in walking in 3 days would be granted to the land to Thomas Penn, to the Penn family, and that would be part of their arrangement. And so, basically, on the border of what's near is it Bucks County, just where the border, and there was the Philadelphia County, Bucks County line. They began this so-called walk, and Thomas Penn had basically hired 3 of the fastest run walkers in Pennsylvania to be there. And so the Lenape's idea of a walk was you went along, you stop to smoke your pipe, you went along, you got some, shot some game, if you saw something, and then gradual walk. These were high-speed runners. These guys could have been in the Olympics.
Sure.
I mean, they were really pushing it, and so they basically just charged up, and the Lenape were horrified. They're fearful. They said, "We know we're being cheated.
Sure.
We're being cheated."
Sure.
But then the walkers didn't stop. One of them gave up. The other one died. He was just collapsed. And the one
right here in Bethlehem.
Right here in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Yes. And the last one finally went all the way up near Mock Chunk, up Jim Thorpe area, and finally fell over. And but he got the he won that, and so
he did what, 63 miles?
63 miles, something like that. Yeah.
Which kind of blew my mind because, I was thinking about this. It's not like he was going up 22.
No, he's following
roads.
Indian paths. He's following Indian trails.
Exactly.
And he's damn lucky the Indians didn't try to plug him. But anyway, they did well. That's the rest of the story. They basically okay. It's over. The walking purchase is over, and then Thomas Penn says, "Well, yeah, that's true, and I have that land, but also if you draw a line like this," and he had his lawyers in London draw this really cool line, and it went up that way, and said, "So that covers all that area." And so I get it, guys. I'm this is what I'm getting. Well, the Lenape were obviously furious.
Sure.
And so eventually, during the French and Indian War, the gentleman who acquired this property, and I'm sorry I can't remember his name at the time, was the winner, ended up having his wife and family and children killed by the Native American right, just to get back at him for what he had done.
Sure.
So it was quite a story.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why would they even agree to that agreement if they knew they were being swindled? Why?
They knew once it had been settled down that they thought they were going to. This was going on. Then they knew, and then they were angry.
Sure.
But Thomas Penn had this treaty, and they didn't know at first. They said, "Well, maybe our ancestors did sign this treaty with your father. Maybe we didn't. We don't know." But it's a walking purchase, so that's it. Thomas Penn had tried other things. He tried auctions. He had tried huge land sales. The problem was that the people would come in from all parts of the world, many of them from Germany, and they had heard that basically, hey, this land is basically free. You can go here and just settle in. And Thomas Penn, no, that's not the bargain, people. I'm Thomas Penn, I'm Thomas Penn, or I'm William Allen. I own the land. Now you pay me.
Right.
And they said, well, we don't have any money to pay you. So, and it was advertised in Europe that this was going to happen, that we could come here and get the land. So here we are. We're getting the land. Eventually, a lot of these people did pay something, but it was very difficult for them. During the Revolution, the Allens basically were Tories or legitimate loyalists, as they said, they prefer to be called. And they basically said, we have a arrangement here, and you have to pay us. And the settlers said, no, we're not paying you. And then once the American government was created, they began paying it all right in continental currency, which didn't have anything behind it.
Right.
So instead of English, as James Allen, William Allen's son, who basically was one of his land agents, James Allen said, I'm as much robbed of my cash as if they stuck their hands in my cash drawer and took it.
So Thomas Penn's strategy, since he lost his land in England, was to come over here, acquire as much land as possible, and then sell it back to the Europeans and make his money.
Yes, and go back to England. He had a huge estate in England, in Buckinghamshire, 5,000 acre estate.
Isn't that the American way?
He was pioneering in that sense.
So besides the Lenape, were there other Indian tribes here as well?
Not in this area. The Iroquois were further north. There was tribes in the western part of Susquehannock. There were a variety of Indian tribes further west in Pennsylvania from here. But the Lenape basically ran from Delaware to Kingston, New York. That was their roaming territory, and west as far out as the Susquehanna River.
Wow. Okay. Now, what happened to the Lenape?
The Lenape, unfortunately, eventually were just shoved again, until finally the last members of their tribe in the early to mid 20th century died off in Oklahoma, which of course was the Indian Territory. Now there are people today who are not. This is an argument.
Okay.
So I have to bring that up, but
Okay.
it is an argument. Are there any pure-blooded Lenape around? Scholars will tell you one way, that they're all gone, and the people who call themselves Lenape today were people whose families intermarried with Lenape, white people, black people who intermarried with Lenape, and so therefore they are Lenape descendants, and they validate themselves that way. And there's some people with names that are not Lenape names, obviously, but they claim to be Lenape, and it's their right to claim it. That's how they see it. They're not Lenape themselves, though, as a tribe, as well. I don't want to get in trouble with people who say they are Lenape now,
Sure,
but
sure.
they think of themselves as a tribe. But people who are at that time period, the pure-blooded and the pure Lenape tribal ties, basically, scholars argue that is actually gone.
Interesting. Wow. And Oklahoma, that's a
Well,
pretty far shove too.
Yeah,
It's not like you're like, hey, just step on
Well,
over
basically,
here.
what happened? Well, they shoved them all there. Basically, and up until the 1890s, it was called Indian Territory, Oklahoma.
Yes.
And it was set aside as a reservation for all the Indians we've kicked out of the East. Here you go. And you can have this piece of land. And then finally, in the 1890s, everybody decided, hey, we want that. And then you had those scenes in the old movies, the Oklahoma Land Rush, where they all go charging up
Yes.
on big three-wheeled bicycles and everything else to grab the land they could.
Interesting.
And, of course, the Native Americans were not allowed to participate in that because that was not the thing.
It just blows my mind. Anyway, let's talk about the first European settlers here in the Lehigh Valley.
Okay.
Who were they, and why did they decide to settle here?
Well, many of them. The settlement of Pennsylvania is itself interesting, but most of the earliest settlers, the English, the Welsh, the people like that, settled in Philadelphia area around Bucks County, and because the land was much better, they settled along the border, what we would consider the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. So areas like Lancaster and York were settled much earlier than up here. The soil was not quite as good up here. It was rocky, it was stony, and so it was kind of like the last place you wanted to go. And so many of the places here, the early settlers, by the time they got here, many of them were Pennsylvania German people. And they came from the Palatinate and the Rhine region of what's now Germany, along the Rhine River, most of them. Some of them were from Switzerland. But also they came and settled in there, in this area, and they came here with the idea of finally owning land. It was they almost impossible for them to own land in Europe.
Okay.
They were on these huge estates, and they had ruled by these princes who had these big palaces that rivaled Versailles, and they were basically taxed to death. And basically, but the main reason why a lot of these people went was to get land. Now, we do have this in our culture that a lot of them came to worship in their own religion they wanted, which is true also. There's a part of that. The early William Penn, when he first opened the area, opened it to Mennonites, basically, and Quakers, and people like him who were not of the religions of other people of Germany. I could get into this. When Germany had like a war, 30 years war, these religions could not get along. And finally, everybody was slaughtering each other. And finally, there was what's called the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And basically what it said was, if the prince in your diocese, prince in your area is a Lutheran, you're a Lutheran. If your prince in your area is Reformed, you're Reformed. If your prince in your area is Catholic, you're a Catholic. Nobody else is allowed to be.
Wow.
You couldn't have any other religion. So tough luck. You didn't want to be anything. Because that's the only way they could figure it out, because they were killing each other, And there were sects, like the Mennonites, who had their own views, and of course they were discounted totally.
Sure.
They were just not there. And so they moved them all out, or they tried to move to the area, and these folks had heard, because William Penn, being a Quaker, had already gone into Germany. He actually went into Germany several times and told them, this is where you can go. And so, as I say, they brought the Mennonites there, and then eventually Germans, who were both Reformed and Lutherans, did not have quite the same religious interest, but they did want land, and like they all wanted a place of their own. They wanted a farm, they wanted land, they wanted to raise a place to raise their families, they wanted a place to live, and they couldn't have that in Europe. And people were going in Europe were saying, you go to America, you go to America, and you go to America. The English and the Welsh and those folks basically concentrated around the area of Philadelphia and on up into Bucks County. And although William Penn wanted to set this place up for religious dissenters, they basically by the years over time, the Pennsylvania Germans and the Scots Irish, these were Scottish people who came from they were people from Northern Ireland.
Right.
And they came here and settled more along the northern border of the colony. And some of them came through Connecticut and other places. And there was, at one point, even before the American Revolution, there were huge battles going on about whether Pennsylvania or Connecticut owned what we considered northern Pennsylvania.
Wow.
There was huge, it was terrific. There were the Penmanite Wars, they were called.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So talk to me about Pennsylvania as a whole in general. So the Penn family claimed ownership of Pennsylvania?
Yes, they did. Well, King Charles was interesting. King Charles II, who was known as the Merry Monarch and had a lot of girlfriends and was considered quite bold and all stuff. William Penn's father had loaned Charles when he was not king, and this is the whole English history thing. But anyway, Charles's father had been executed, and Charles had gone overseas, and he was trying to find life for himself. And so William Penn's father, Sir William Penn, who was an admiral in the British Navy, said, "I will loan you money to survive on for a time." And so after that, it was basically that area, that whole relationship was not too clear. And William Penn is at this time trying to find a colony in this new area. That there were Swedish people here and a few others, but in that area, Pennsylvania, which is now Philadelphia, most of it was in dispute. But the kings in those days, they just drew the lines and they said, "Here you go." And so William Penn goes to him and said, "Look, my father, you owe my father a lot of money. He's not around anymore, so I'm his son. Now, I need what I want is not the money. You give me some land, and when I want to establish a colony in the New World in Pennsylvania, and what will be." So he created Pennsylvania, and originally, interestingly, Penn wanted to name this place New Wales, and so we'd all be New Wales now. And I don't know what sounds like a Australian rugby team.
New Whalian, I guess.
New Whalians,
yeah.
Yes. And so he came upon Charles one day, and we have this Penn's testimony on this. He actually did see this. He sent a letter to a friend right after it happened. He saw Charles had written up a charter and making the man land Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's Woods. And William Penn said, "You can't do that. People will think I'm an egomaniac. What are you trying to say? I don't want to do it that way.
Right.
This is New Wales. I'm creating New Wales." And Penn and Charles, sort of with we assume a chuckle, said, "You can't say. We're not naming it for you. We're naming it for your father. So don't flatter yourself."
It just blows my mind, the absolute gall that the Europeans had to just start claiming land when it was already occupied.
Yeah, well, the problem was the Europeans and the Native Americans had a totally different concept of the purpose of land. The Native Americans saw land where you went and you farmed and then you moved on. They were migratory. They had what is sometimes called a roaming territory.
Sure.
As I think I mentioned earlier, the Lenape went down to Delaware and up to Kingston, New York, and further west. That was their territory, and it fluctuated. There are wars between the Indians over territory, but they were just different. Nobody tried to take the whole damn thing.
Well, it's my understanding that the Native Americans had a very much different relationship with land. It was more of a spiritual thing. You were part of the land. You didn't own anything, whereas the Europeans are like, I own this.
Right. Well, the Europeans are coming out of a tradition that is basically one that went back to ancient times. The Romans, the Greeks, the rest of them, they owned land.
Right.
And so they went through that period. And in medieval Europe, if you were the noble, you owned the land, and then you had your peasants, and I'm in charge of my castle here, and if you're going to have a problem, you can run in here, peasants, but by the way, I'm going to tax you for being here,
right.
and the rest of it. So it was ingrained in them for years. So there was a whole kind of misunderstanding about the relationship, I think, at first. And then the Native Indians realized that, hey, what are you guys doing? You're just taking it land. We're not sharing it. And
right.
he said, well, not nice words, you.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow. All right, so let's transition a little bit further. This area is really well known for its industry, obviously because of Bethlehem Steel.
Right.
How did we become superpower, if you will?
Glad you asked that question. Basically, the industrial age spawned here in the Lehigh Valley because of the Lehigh Canal. And the Lehigh Canal was created by two gentlemen named Josiah White and Erskine Hazard. And both of them were interested in getting water to the various industries. They had heard that there was coal north of here.
Okay.
Up in the coal regions. And so they wanted a way to get that coal down here to this area of Pennsylvania. And so they talked to the legislature, and the legislature gave them the rights to basically own the Lehigh River. And the legislature thought they were all crazy. One legislator said, here, we'll give you the right to ruin yourselves. Because you couldn't do this, but they had studied how canals were built in England. Erskine Hazard had gone over there. He'd seen how they did it, and he brought over a lot of Irishmen who basically, as one source said, died six to a grave digging this canal. And they dug it up there to Mock Chunk and down to Bristol and Philadelphia area so the coal could come down. Now the coal is coming down. What do you want? You have the coal. At least people are lighting their homes with it, and they're warming their homes with it, and they're very happy with it. But we need other areas. Doesn't this sound familiar? How are we going to make more uses of this, brown rock we're selling people? And basically they said, aha, industry. But what can we do? How can you take this anthracite coal? So Erskine Hazard went over to England, where he met a man named George Crane. And George Crane owned an ironworks in England. And he basically said to Hazard, well, I really don't handle that end of thing. I do the financing. But talk to David Thomas. He's my iron master. He's a Welshman, and he knows all about this. And so Thomas had discovered the secret of how you got anthracite coal hot enough to make it an industrial fuel. And this was something that revolutionized. And so what Erskine Hazard said to him was, you come to America, you build this iron furnace, and it's yours. And we'll make a deal with you. So he and his first there was some dispute within Thomas's family because he had an elderly mother and he was afraid she was going to die. And finally his wife said to him, "Look, you have 5 sons. They're all going to need things to do. Your mother's here, and who knows what relationship the mother and mother-in-law had. But anyway, we should go to America. You never get a deal like this." And so he did. He got a good deal. And they gave him a house. So he came here, sort of interesting. He ended up getting stuck on Staten Island for a long time because of bad weather. But finally he took a stagecoach across New Jersey and then into the Lehigh Valley. And he came to look for a supply of water, and he went to Catasauqua. And Catasauqua had exactly what he was looking for, and right near the canal area. And so in the 1840s, he created what is basically and as my old friend Lance Metz, since deceased, would say, was first anthracite coal-powered industrial iron furnace in America.
Interesting.
The industrial age of Pennsylvania, the industrial age in America, basically began in Lehigh Valley.
Wow.
In Catasauqua.
Wow.
And a lot of people don't know that.
No.
A lot of people think, it all began with the cotton mills in New England. And since a lot of the early historians were from New England, that's what everybody thought. Well,
Sure.
No, they began here. It began here in Catasauqua, which at that time was called Berrysport, after John Berry, who owned the place. And it grew out. It spread out. And finally, by the 1850s and 60s, this whole area, Allentown, had huge number of iron furnaces. There were huge iron investments all up and down the area. And basically what happened with Bethlehem Steel was in the 1850s, a gentleman owned that property. He built an iron furnace, the Sakona Iron Company. And I'm sorry if his name escapes me at the moment, but he owned that property. And it was just a run-of-the-mill iron furnace. And then you get Robert Sayre. And Robert Sayre, who is of middle-town New York roots, whatever, and he is up there in Mock Chunk with now Asa Packer, who was a fairly well-to-do canal boat owner. And he said, what should we do? And he said, well, let's create a railroad. And so they eventually, Packer and them, they created a railroad out of that area. And it was called the Delaware Railroad, but eventually it became the Lehigh Railroad.
Okay.
And they established it, but they said, the problem is the rails. The rails are too expensive. We have to ship the rails from England. England makes the railroad rails. That's way too expensive. We need a rail-making facility here in the Lehigh Valley. And so they bought this Sakona Iron Company from this fellow, and they began to expand it, and went through some rough times at first in the early 1860s. But they acquired a gentleman named John Fritz. John Fritz was a master the leading iron master in the country at that point in the late 1850s, early 60s. He created something called the Three-High Rail Mill. Now, this was kind of like a strange sort of situation, but what they would do in the early rail mills, it was used to call it two-high rail mill, is actually they would get the rail white hot, the guys would carry it around to the other side and take it through another set of rolls, so it would cool and then become a railroad rail. And that's very simplistic, but that's how best I can explain to it. Well, Fritz was working at an iron furnace out in Johnstown, and he said, "Hey, this is ridiculous. Why don't we just add another set of rolls?" And so he put another set of rolls in, went through up and down and down, and bingo, you had a rail, and you didn't have to wait for it to cool because it could just be cool as it goes through.
Sure.
And this was something that nobody else thought of, but John Fritz thought of this. And Robert Sayre heard about this, and he contacted Fritz. Fortunately, at the time, Fritz was sort of betwixt and between things. He didn't want to stick around Johnstown. He didn't like it. He wrote a really nasty letter about the cows and the pigs running in the streets. But but Fritz said, Sayre said to Fritz, "You come here, you come to Bethlehem, and I can guarantee you a good job, well paid, and also a high-level place in our company. And I'm backed by Asa Packer, who is very wealthy, and he wants to do this, and I want to do this, and this is what we want to do. And we want you." So basically, John Fritz on the mechanical end and Robert Sayre on the business and finance end basically created Bethlehem Steel. They were the creators of what at the time was called Bethlehem Iron.
Okay.
And then in the 1890s, 1900, it became Bethlehem Steel Corporation.
So it all started with railroad production, basically.
Yes.
And then I would assume both the world wars kind of helped.
Well, quite. Yeah, well, but long before that, Bethlehem, in the 1870s, the United States went through an economic depression, the Panic of 1873. The country had basically, their prosperity was built on building railroads. And there's a lot of high flyers, a man named Jay Cook in Philadelphia, who was a very big deal. And he had this big bank. And then in 1873, what happened was two railroads were competing each other way out west, and it just collapsed, just fell apart. They because basically what happened was the financing had stopped. You can't. There's only so much money that you could shove into railroads. Most of it was coming from England, by the way.
Okay.
Basically, the industrial America was financed by European capital, although people don't. Americans, oh my God, European capital, whoa, that's terrible. No, we were hardy guys, we just did it. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. So they had got this money from Europe, and they basically invested that in the railroads, and the railroads began to take off. And then the wars, well, Bethlehem played a small part in the Civil War, basically because every time General Sherman tore up those rails in the South, somebody had to replace them.
Sure.
With the war was over, and so they replaced them. And those were iron rails. And then in the 1870s, there was a panic, an industrial panic. The railroad rails stopped building, and a lot of them in Allentown closed at that point. And it was a really terrible. It was a really strong economic panic. A lot of people were unemployed. It was a bad situation. And so fortunately, Sayre and Fritz had been working together and saying, even before the panic, saying, we need to make steel rails. And over in England, a fellow named Bessemer has got the steel process, and he's the one we have to talk to. The steel process. How do you make steel and rails, and how would you go about doing this? And so, what they did was they sent Fritz over to England and France and Germany. The Krupps wouldn't let him into their furnaces. They were busy getting ready for a war with France, and so they didn't want him in. But the French let him in, and the English let him in, and Fritz came back with all the ideas. And finally, in 1873, he created the first steel rails in America. And
now, is steel easier to produce or cheaper to produce?
It's cheap. Well, it's more durable.
Okay.
Iron rails broke.
Okay.
Iron rails broke, had a terrific tendency. Bethlehem Iron in the 1860s was actually shipping its rails around the Cape Horn from Africa up South America, sending them up to San Francisco, where they were being used by the Central Pacific Railroad.
Wow.
So the railroad that you see those pictures, those guys waving that thing, those rails were from Bethlehem.
Get out.
Not the Union Pacific. They were there was another company, but Central Pacific Rails came from Bethlehem around Cape Horn and up to San Francisco, and those rails all came from Bethlehem. We have the few remaining order books we have tell us this. So this whole thing. So, but with creation of steel rails, it enabled the people at that time, the investors say, look, we can sell you steel rails. The English are too expensive. That we can sell you our rails, or steel rails, cheap, and also because Asa Packer runs the Lehigh Valley Railroad, he could use those steel rails and like advertising, and so the iron rails died.
Okay.
The iron rail industry died, and the steel industry took over. But then by the 1880s, basically what was happening is that the rail market was getting glutted. I mean, the steel rails were so durable, they were sticking around for quite a while, and so they weren't selling as many as they wanted to. So Fritz and Sayre got together, and they contacted people they knew in Washington. And at that time, there was a movement to change the U.S. Navy, which had shrunk dramatically after the Civil War, and somebody said Paraguay had a bigger navy than the U.S. at that time.
Oh, wow. So
what happened was then they would get contacts in the Navy Department and say, get contracts. We at Bethlehem, we know the steel secrets. We can make steel armor plate for you. We can make steel cannon for you. And so they said, fine, here's a contract. And Fritz, who was a very, very brilliant mechanical guy, created those big buildings that you used to see at Bethlehem Steel. There's a big, tall, it's still there. It's called they actually would raise a cannon up, a naval cannon.
Oh, in the high house.
High house.
Yeah.
In the high house, they would lower it into there, and they basically would take it down, and it would like hiss and steam and smoke and everything else. But it was very impressive, apparently. But they could do it. They did it. They were willing to invest their money that they had in new technologies. So in any extent, they're like companies today who look for the newest technology and follow it. And so that's what they were doing. They were basically, Fritz and Sayre basically created this steel company. And then in which I just wrote an article about it, how this the Japanese, they basically started selling weapons to both sides in the Russo-Japanese War, which was in 1905. They were both shooting at each other with Bethlehem Steel cannon, their navies.
Oh, my gosh.
And Japanese were a little bit more skillful at it, so they won. But it was so Bethlehem was already on the stage in the 1890s. They were building the ships that beat Spain in the Spanish-American War. They were already a strong steel force, and that led to the introduction of Charles Michael Schwab. And Charles Schwab had a long history involved in the steel interests in the western part of the state. He had been a protege of Andrew Carnegie's. He had been also very close to J.P. Morgan, which always helps. And in 1900, at the age of, as many historians say, the tender age of 39, he was made president of what was the largest company in the United States, U.S. Steel. So it was basically Carnegie's interests and Morgan's interests that collided and created U.S. Steel. And Schwab, who was, everybody liked him, he was a nice guy, and he also knew steel. And so basically that's what happened. He created the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. He purchased Bethlehem Steel, Schwab did, from the heirs of Sayre's heirs, basically, from that to this Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and he just greatly expanded it. He was very well known for doing that, and he was a master salesman. He was a master salesman, Schwab, and that was what the real things he could do.
Well, it's amazing to me. I don't think a lot of people realize how much of America is actually built by Bethlehem Steel.
Oh, yes.
A lot of
office buildings.
Office buildings in major U.S. cities.
Oh, yes.
I remember driving across the Golden Gate Bridge in California. That's mostly Bethlehem Steel.
Oh, that's great. That was during the 30s. That was Gene Grace, who was Schwab's protege and later his guy who was running the whole operation. And they at that point in the 30s, they were looking for business, Bethlehem, because they were running low. They had a great boom in the 20s. Well, first of all, you were asking me before about the naval, the military aspects. They had a great World War I, and they made money. Actually, the Schwab had links with the British Admiralty. Winston Churchill came to be a close acquaintance of his.
Oh, wow.
The British wanted submarines. They couldn't get them fast enough, and so Schwab said, "I can get them to you faster," and he did. And Churchill said, "No, great, yes, that's submarines." And so and munitions. They sold munitions. Bethlehem Steel made tons of. They were the largest. Bethlehem Steel was the largest single supplier of munitions to the Allied cause in World War I.
No kidding.
No kidding.
Wow.
No kidding.
How about World War II?
World War II was a little bit different because the government contractors were spread more evenly to other parts of the country.
Okay.
But they still did rather well. And Grace in World War II was able to produce a ship a day for the government, for what they call it the Liberty ships. The transport
a ship a day?
Yeah, well, even more than a ship a day.
Wow.
Towards the end of the war, they were producing more than a ship a day. And these were very talented steel workers who were doing all this. And they had to know what they were doing, and so and Grace was different than Schwab. Schwab he didn't like unions. He didn't like those unions that coming in, but Schwab was at least he liked the men. He'd go around, walk around the plant. How you doing? How's the wife? How's the kids? Have a cigar. He didn't smoke himself, but he gave out cigars to the guys. But Grace was like, no, I'm not a regular guy. I'm the guy who owns one of the largest steel companies in the world. Thank you.
Right. So how, not to jump from the 1940s to, say, the 1980s, but what happened? How do we go from being such an industrial superpower to nothing?
Well, thereby hangs a tale. There are a lot of factors. First of all, in 1945, the European steel was gone. It was destroyed by the war. And Japan didn't have anything Nothing. They were destroyed in the war, too. So basically, it was glory days at Bethlehem Steel from the 1940s into the 1960s, when they were running basically the steel leadership position in the world. And they were building buildings. They were building the skyline in New York. They were building the skyline. Well, they started building the skyline in New York back in the 20s. Extensive research has been done to find out if there's any Bethlehem Steel in the Empire State Building. Unfortunately, there's not. The Chrysler Building has a lot in it, and a lot of other major buildings in New York have Bethlehem Steel. The I-beam steel, the H-beam, Bethlehem Steel H-beam was what created a lot of those buildings. So, but you're interested in what's happened. Well, it basically, the Japanese caught up eventually. And the Bethlehem Steel's means of production were very different. You went out to the Mesabi Range, you got all these railroad cars, you put all the iron ore into Bethlehem, you create the steel here, then you make the steel beams, and then we sell you the steel beams. And there was other companies like Nucor were being created who basically took recycled steel, and that was what they decided to use. There were a lot of questions about in the 1950s about the major steel strike of 1959 and basically what was going on there, and so there was a lot of pressure going on with the steel, and so eventually, what you could say, competition caught up from Europe and Japan against Bethlehem Steel, and the way they made steel was just not as efficient as it could be. So there was no John Fritz or Robert Sayre there apparently to whisper in their ear, "Hey guys, you got to keep up with these guys, otherwise they're going to screw you," and they did. And that's what happened eventually, and also because of the steel structure, people the way the Bethlehem Steel was structured, they had these. First, Boys of Bethlehem under Schwab, and then you had the loop course with Bethlehem Steel, where they would send the executives through, and they would learn the whole thing through the old-fashioned way. And Grace was brilliant at doing one thing. His motto was always more production, but then always more production wasn't enough.
Sure. Sure.
And so and technology changed, and now they make steel in India and steel in Africa, and steel all over the world. No one ever thought they would be making steel in the 1950s, and a lot of the men at Bethlehem Steel, they protested and said, well, this is the problem with they were building these things overseas and all the rest of it, and it's all their problem, and it's all their fault, and get higher tariffs and keep out the Japanese steel. But even with the tariffs, Japanese steel was cheaper, and the steel in India was just really cheaper. And so I think, and I don't want to necessarily be quoted, I think Bethlehem Steel became owned by a man named Meitel, who basically was from India. Eventually, towards the end of its career as a functioning company. Now you have to understand, Bethlehem Steel was not just in Bethlehem.
Correct.
Bethlehem Steel was a large number of places all over the country, and and Buffalo, New York, and
I was going to say, do you happen to know how far their reach was?
Well, let's see. You were mentioning before about Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco. They owned the company that McClintock and Marshall that Bethlehem Steel took over. Was they made the steel for the bridge, and they shipped it around to San Francisco. But basically, it was a major steel company, and so it was going all over the country. And there's a great story about Eugene Grace was going out to Bethlehem, got to San Francisco for the first time, and so Golden Gate Bridge was going up, and he wanted to see it, and so they rowed him out to the bridge, and they took him on a yacht or something, I'm sure, and they went underneath the bridge, and there was a big sign, and it said McClintock and Marshall. Well, he had a cow.
Oh, I bet.
He had an absolute cow, and just said, where? They are not. They are our subsidiary. They are not Bethlehem Steel.
Right.
And 3 weeks later, there was a big sign that said Bethlehem Steel. Funny how things happen like that.
Yeah, the squeaky wheel gets the grease,
yes,
right?
Yes, indeed, especially if you own the company.
We were just talking about the Bethlehem Steel.
Right.
And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up St. Luke's University Health Network.
Of course.
And St. Luke's, if I'm correct, was founded to provide service to the steel workers. Is that correct?
Very definitely. Robert Sayre was a very active Episcopalian, and he understood the concept of now if you do well, then you have to do good. And so he was seeing these outrageous industrial accidents taking place at Bethlehem Iron Company in those days, where there were almost no protections at all, which was common across the country. I mean, nothing existed, even anything like it at the time. And Sayre, who, as I said, an Episcopalian, was a very devout Episcopalian, understood St. Luke's role, the actual St. Luke in the Gospel, who wrote the Gospel, and as a physician. And so he and some of the other people, he managed to persuade Asa Packer, who was not exactly a guy who threw money around, except on himself, to create a hospital. Because before this, the nearest hospital was Philadelphia.
Oh, wow.
And so you had to put these 4 fellows on a train, and if they survived after a 2 to 3 hour trip to Philadelphia, and then they got to the hospital, then they were lucky that they survived. And so
I'm going to go ahead and say if you had an industrial accident, that's an hour and a half away. That's by car today. Chances are you're not going to be faring too well if you have to go all the way down to Philly.
Yeah, and Asa Packer, who was also by conversion converted to Episcopalian church, was very interested in showing that he was a prominent churchman, and this was what he was going to do. So Bethlehem Steel and was very instrumental in creating St. Luke's Hospital. They built these big buildings at the time that were state-of-the-art pavilions, they called them, and a lot of air and a lot of sunshine and a lot of open windows, this kind of thing, to get things through there and to get the people taken care of before they died, or to help them, give them health care, which nobody else was giving them. These people could not afford doctors. The doctors were something that happened to middle-class people and wealthy people, did not happen to them. And so St. Luke's provided that significant role in the creation of healthcare in the Lehigh Valley.
Now, this may sound like a stupid question, but was it designed specifically for steel workers, or was it open to the public immediately?
No, it was just steel workers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Just steel workers, and it was gradually open to the public. I think there was a Dr. Estes who came here later, and he's a very pivotal figure in St. Luke's in the 19th and early 20th century. I'm a little vague on details of him, but I know he came from another part of the country, and he was basically the one that founded St. Luke's reputation as a major hospital in that time period.
And St. Luke's is celebrating their 150th?
150, yes.
Yeah, wow. That's incredible. So, all right, let's stick with the steel for a sec. Another major talking point would be Martin Tower.
Okay.
Can you give us a little background on Martin Tower? And I think there's a love-hate relationship with Martin Tower.
Well, I did an article on 60 for 69 on Martin Tower, and I was very fortunate to have 2 very good friends. Fortunately, the late Craig Bartholomew and his wife Ann, who's still alive, and they had done quite a bit of. Craig worked for Bethlehem Steel in the purchasing department for many years, but he was a real historian of iron, and so he was my mentor in a lot of things. So he told me he was there present at the creation of Martin Tower, and he told me all about it. They basically were trying to show that Bethlehem Steel was here to stay in the area. It was in 1968-69. There were some questions. Japan had not outpaced Bethlehem Steel yet, but they would in the 70s. And so this building was created primarily also to honor Mr. Martin, who was an executive, had been an executive at the Steel, and it also was to show that Bethlehem Steel cared about its community. And so they built this steel tower, which was, by the way, about 12 inches taller than Allentown's PP&L building. And some people said when it was exploded, well, okay, well, there what happened. But in any event, the building was constructed by Bethlehem Steel with Bethlehem Steel products, Bethlehem Steel, and it was in the 1960s, it was considered a landmark. They actually, when they built it, they spent an awful lot of money on the executives' offices, as I was told. Craig knew this. He saw Craig Bartholomew knew this, and he was with the purchasing department. And they would say, nothing is too good for Bethlehem Steel. And so they've had doorknobs with the Bethlehem Steel I-beam logo put in. And when the carpets were damaged in transit and they were trying to install them and they didn't work out, they had the people who made the carpets come to Bethlehem and actually make the carpets over again.
Wow.
So and it was a time of Bethlehem Steel was the end of the sunset period when people were still thinking that they could not have imagined a Lehigh Valley without Bethlehem Steel, and Martin Tower was a symbol of that to them at that time period. It's interesting. Bethlehem touted it in its newsletter. It was built by a corporation in New York. It had all kinds of connections with the corporate world. And when it was built, the steel executives said, this is an example of our commitment to the Bethlehem community, and we're here to stay. I mean, they actually used those words.
Sure.
And it began built in August of 1929. Bulldozers were here, and they had pictures of all the executives standing around looking at the scale models and all the rest of it. They had prominent politicians. Bethlehem's Mayor Payro was here at that point, and he gave a really rousing speech. But almost before the building was finally opened in the early 70s, they were beginning to wonder, do we really need all these executives?
Oh.
Already they were beginning to wonder that.
Now, did they move their corporate offices from the south side over to Martin Tower?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. And it might have been also a way of getting a little bit of distance between them and the Grace years, because Grace was such a commanding, dominant figure that people thought of Bethlehem Steel, they thought of Eugene Grace, and that was it. So that was going to be a real major kind of like his heirs, if you will, Martin and some of the rest of Mr. Martin and some of the rest of them who had gone through the loop course and been through, and George Hurd and those people had been through that, and now this was their building. This was going to be their symbol of theirs. But whether they were trying to fool themselves or they just weren't looking for what was going on, some Bethlehem Steel executives in the 50s, when confronted a reporter for the New York World Telegram and Sun, was asking a business writer, saying, well, what, aren't you afraid of the Japan? This is 1957. And this fellow was interesting. I think it was Arthur Martin himself. They asked him about it, and he said, I don't believe you. He said, I don't believe it.
Wow.
So he wasn't going to believe it. But believe it or not, there it was. It was happening. And by 1975, Japan is now outdistancing Bethlehem Steel and the American steel industry. They're now selling more steel, and bingo. That's...
So when did Martin Tower open? You said 72
or 73, I think.
And the last cast was
90 something. Yeah. 95.
Wow.
I think.
So it was it had 20 some years of,
and that was getting emptied and emptied and emptied. And by the 1980s, a good chunk of the office space was not being used because there weren't executives anymore.
I remember working there when I was in college. I worked for Dun & Bradstreet as a collections agent. Had nothing to do with the steel.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. All right, let's transition a little bit. We're kind of backtracking here, but let's talk about Prohibition.
Oh, yes.
And the Great Depression. How did both of those things affect residents here in the Lehigh Valley?
Well, Bethlehem has had like most of the Lehigh Valley. I talked to a guy who was a young man in the Allentown area, who was later was William Tamblyn. He was later cartoonist and photographer for the Morning Call and the Evening Chronicle. And he was a young man at the time, and he said in those days the Lehigh Valley floated on a sea of booze, and he used to wave his hand like this. And it was everywhere. It was everything, the Prohibition, speakeasies and all the rest of it.
Here?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, yes.
Wow.
South Bethlehem was notorious.
No kidding.
Oh God, it was nationally known. H.L. Mencken, the critic, came here to hear the Bach B minor Mass with Alfred Knopf of Knopf Publishing, and they wanted to get a drink. And he wrote a great essay about this. It's classic Mencken. So he said that they saw places with seafood house over them, which, as he wrote, which was the universal euphemism for beer in America in the 13 awful years, as he called them.
No kidding.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh gosh. Yes. Oh gosh. Yes. The place was gangsters. Gangsters. There was a Bethlehem cop killed in a shootout with some gangsters. See, the problem was the New York mob was moving in. They didn't like the local folks. The territory was getting too hot, too big, and so they started to move in from New York, and they were rivaling. And of course the whorehouses, it was pardon the expression, and there's a lot of prostitution.
Was there like a red light district here?
Yes, in the South Side, it was basically a red light district. There were a lot of You see, a lot of those places have disappeared, obviously, because of urban renewal and other things. But in those days, they had houses, and that was what got this one cop killed. He broke into these gangsters who were taking over this house of prostitution. It was in the papers. Morning Call had a huge articles about it, and people, they were horrified. A lot of people expressed horror, but nobody was doing anything about it.
Was the valley known for any specific type of booze production, or was it moonshine
beer? Beer was very popular. Beer was primary because of a lot of the Germanic background of the folks, and a lot of that Dutch Schultz tried to move in on Neuweiler's brewery in Allentown, and he was quickly told that we make only honest beer here. The Neuweilers were actually pretty straight-laced on that subject. But a lot of these places were because it was really borderline stuff you could do, the whiskey and the rest of the stuff, between making the other things and making beer. So
That's interesting, and I find the correlation between then and now even more fascinating, because this area is starting to really explode with microbreweries.
Yes.
So it's like beer never left this area.
No, not really. So, and then you want to talk about the Great Depression. When Bethlehem Steel in the 1920s was making a lot of money off of skyscraper construction. And we have a letter from a young woman who was from Allentown at the time, and she was writing to somebody else from Allentown, and she said, I can barely hear myself think with the rivet guns going. This was the summer of 1929. And then they all stopped. There was no more investment. No need to build office buildings when you're unemploying people. That went through it. And so that's what happened. And they basically went down. It just started. Bethlehem Steel, by the 1935 or so, is running 3 days a week.
Wow.
But other historians of the steel industry, my friend Lance Metz, Craig Bartholomew, Ann Bartholomew, told me that it was good because Grace was keeping it going. He wasn't closing it down. He had enough sense to know someday it'll come back, and someday we're going to be doing this. He did have problems with Schwab, because Schwab basically was going broke, and some of the board members were getting anxious about Schwab and why we continue to pay this guy, and Grace kind of protected him, made sure he had a seat on the board, paid him $100,000 a year, and so that could save him from paying.
Wow. So, all right, so let's talk about the Great Depression.
Yes.
And obviously it impacted the entire country, but
right.
How severe was the impact here in the Lehigh Valley?
Actually, it was fairly severe in Bethlehem, basically, because they had one industry. Steel was industry. And as they used to say, when steel is dull, the whole town suffers. And steel was really dull during the Depression. Allentown, interestingly, was not. Allentown actually there were bank closings in Allentown, but only 2. The people in Allentown in that time period, the leadership of the community, were very aware of what was going on, and they kept a tight rein on business failures, business closing. Of course, business was bad. It was all bad everywhere. But they were more, they were able to make it through the Depression without what happened with Bethlehem, because they had a broader base of industries and a variety of things that was going on there, and textiles and the silk industry was still big, although it had been reduced obviously in size but they managed to keep it going. Allentown was lucky in that regard, and it was led by people who were lucky.
Is this area real well known for textiles? I mean, I know
it was. Oh yes,
there was the silk mill down in Easton.
Right.
Was there a silk mill in Allentown? Quite a few?
Quite a few.
Okay.
Quite a few. The first one was back to the 1880s. Allentown was coming out of the panic in 1873. They were looking for a new industry in the 1880s. They knew that in some silk mills in Patterson and wanted to relocate, so they came. So they suggested they come here, and they did. And that was when they did. They were welcomed with open arms, and then the ancillary industries came out of that, like furniture making. You have the silk, you got to make upholstery, and where do you put the silk upholstery is silk upholstery. So, or that kind of thing. It was that sort of industry, and the silk industry. And later on, when silk faded in the 30s, textiles were coming in, and Allentown had a thriving textile industry into the 1960s.
How about prominent historical figures that came through this area?
Oh, good Lord. Okay, let's see. George Washington was through Bethlehem, of course, in the 1700s. During the Revolution, he was through here.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh yeah. He stayed at the Sun Inn and that kind of thing. He was stopped in and saw the Moravian women, and they received him well. This was about 1783. He was a famous lady he also went through Nazareth.
Okay.
And there was a lady there in Nazareth who was just, as we would say today, a fan. And so she asked him for a lock of his hair, and he gave it to her.
Oh, no kidding.
And they still preserve it at the Moravian Historical Society.
Oh, my
gosh. A
gosh.
lock of George Washington's hair.
Wow.
It's like with Elvis in the 50s, so give me a lock of your hair, Elvis. And so he did. He came through here. And John Adams, no, maybe in the coach. Thomas Jefferson, no. And James Madison, I'm thinking presidents now, prominent people. Martin Van Buren, who was Andrew Jackson's vice president, came through here. He spent the night in Allentown, which is the only. And he came to Bethlehem and was also was feted by the local Democratic Party. He was getting ready for a re-election, but he had relatives who lived down in other parts of Pennsylvania, and so the road passed through here. So Martin Van Buren, who was president, when he was president, stayed in the Lehigh Valley. He's the only president known to have actually spent the night here in office. Theodore Roosevelt was through the valley quite extensively. He was very popular here, in Allentown in particular.
There's a photograph at, I don't know if you've ever been to the Wooden Match.
Oh, yeah.
There's a photograph of a president. I'm not quite sure. Was it FDR, maybe?
FDR was not here except to pass through on the train.
I think it was Teddy Roosevelt talking in Allentown.
Yes, and it's one of the coolest photographs I've ever seen.
I mean, he's leaning over the balcony.
Yes.
Of the Hotel Allen.
Yes.
And that's when he was running for the progressive candidate for president. He had left the White House in 1908, turned it over to William Howard Taft, who was the Republican nominee and was elected president. But, of course, Teddy, being Teddy, couldn't stand not being in the limelight. And at first he was very proud of Taft, but then he thought Taft was not pushing enough, not hard enough. And so he got tied up with the progressives. And, it was October of 1914. And, he was at the balcony of the Hotel Allen, and he was waving to the crowds down below. And he came through Allentown times. He came through Allentown as president in 1905. Didn't get off the train, but there was a huge mob around the train. And, of course, Kennedy and Nixon were both here in 1960. And Kennedy spoke to a crowd at Center Square in Allentown, and he was here in Bethlehem. He stayed at the Hotel Bethlehem. There's pictures up on the wall, and I know Nixon was in Allentown. I don't know whether he was ever in Bethlehem. Maybe he was. Could very well have been. I can't quite put that out. Eisenhower was here in Bethlehem and in Allentown. Not Allentown, but he was in Bethlehem and in Easton, in particular.
Interesting.
Both of the times as general. He was a general. He wasn't running for president at that point.
Right. Very good. Well, Frank, thanks so much for taking the time. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. Frank Whelan, historian extraordinaire. Thank you.
Thank you.